Jesus walks up to a tree. It's full of leaves. From a distance, it looks alive. But when he gets closer, there is no fruit. So Jesus speaks to it. And by the next morning, the tree is dead. That alone is strange. But what Jesus says next is where the real tension begins. Peter notices the tree and says, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." And Jesus does not explain the miracle. He does not talk about judgment, power, signs. Instead, he says this: have faith in God. That feels disconnected. A dead tree is a statement about faith, but Jesus isn't finished. He starts talking about prayer, about moving mountains, about asking and believing. And then he talks about forgiveness. Forgiveness also feels out of place here. Why would Jesus move from a supernatural act to interpersonal mercy? Why connect faith with prayer and then end with forgiving people who hurt you? Those ideas don't naturally go together, unless this passage is not about power at all. Because Jesus didn't curse the tree to show strength, he used it to expose something. And the question we have to ask is simple: why does Jesus connect faith, prayer, and forgiveness in the same breath? That's where the story actually begins. Most people already know how this passage is supposed to work. Jesus says you can move mountains. Jesus says believe when you pray. So the conclusion feels obvious. If you believe enough, God will act. If you don't get the results, you didn't have enough faith. That reading is everywhere. It turns faith into a measurement, prayer into a mechanism, and God into the response. But that interpretation creates a quiet problem because Jesus never says, have faith in what you ask. He says, have faith in God. That is a completely different category. It is not positive thinking dressed up as spirituality. It is trust. And trust is relational, not transactional. Which means this passage is not teaching us how to control God. It is teaching us how to stand before Him. That's why the mountain language is there. Not to promise spectacle, but to establish scale. Jesus is saying there's no limit to God's power, but he immediately shifts the focus away from power and towards posture. Because belief without alignment is not biblical faith, and prayer without trust is not prayer, it's demand. This is where the reading starts to unravel. Because if this passage were really about believing harder, then forgiveness would be irrelevant. And yet, Jesus refuses to separate them, which means the popular interpretation is missing something essential. Not something hidden, something stated plainly. This moment doesn't happen in isolation. Jesus doesn't curse the fig tree on a quiet afternoon walk. It happens during his final week in Jerusalem, just after something far more confrontational. Jesus enters the temple, the place meant for prayer, for repentance, for people to meet God, and he finds commerce, money changing hands, worship turned into transaction. So he shuts it down. And then on the way out of the city, the fig tree full of leaves, promising fruit but offering nothing. That detail matters because fig trees aren't random scenery, they are symbols. Symbols of Israel, of spiritual life, of outward appearance versus inward reality. A tree that looks alive but produces nothing is not neutral, it's deceptive. And suddenly the miracle makes sense. Jesus isn't angry at a plant, he's exposing a system. A form of religion that looks vibrant but cannot nourish anyone. Leaves without fruit, ritual without mercy, faith without transformation. That's why the teaching follows immediately after. Because the fig tree and the temple are telling the same story. And now, Jesus turns to his disciples and says, have faith in God, not faith in institutions or rituals or performance, but faith in God. And that is why forgiveness matters so much, because nothing reveals fruitlessness faster than the refusal to forgive. This is the line that Jesus adds that changes everything. And when you stand praying, standing is temple language. It's worship posture. It's approaching God. Jesus is not talking about casual prayer. He's talking about coming before God's presence. And then he says this: if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them. No softening, just a condition, which means forgiveness, is not an optional add-on to faith. It is the evidence of it. But Jesus ties it to something measurable: relational mercy. You cannot ask God to release power while you refuse to release debt. You cannot trust God's judgment while insisting on your own. And Jesus is very precise here. He doesn't say if they deserve it. He doesn't say if they apologize. He says if you hold anything. That includes wounds, injustice, betrayal. And why? Because unforgiveness is not just emotional, it's theological. It says, I do not trust God to judge rightly. And that is why it fractures prayer. Not because God withholds blessing, but because unforgiveness reveals where our trust actually sits. Faith that moves mountains does not grip resentment, it releases it. Jesus doesn't end this teaching with power, he ends it with the heart. Because faith was never about forcing God to act, it was about trusting God enough to let go. Faith that moves mountains is not loud, it does not demand outcomes, it does not insist on control, it rests. And that kind of faith always shows itself the same way. Mercy. If I trust God to be just, I can forgive. If I trust God with what was taken from me, I can release what I'm holding. That's why Jesus ties everything together here. Faith, prayer, forgiveness, not as techniques, but as signs of alignment. The fig tree had leaves but no fruit. Jesus isn't looking for leaves. He's looking for what grows when faith is real. And that fruit is mercy. So when Jesus says, have faith in God, he isn't inviting us into spectacle. He's inviting us into trust. The kind that lets go. The kind that forgives. The kind that finally understands what moving mountains really is.